A Victorian Gentleman's Ghostly Anthology, read by John Banks. The Steel Mirror, by W. Fenn. We have, most of us, at one time or other, had some experience in curious coincidences, mere matters of accident, which have fallen out so strangely as to wear the appearance of a forelaid scheme, coincidences which have given rise in men's minds to the idea of destiny, fate, or whatever we may please to call it, coincidences which, be they what they may, have without doubt been the basis of all superstition from time immemorial. Presentiments, in a measure, are common to everybody, and even the most matter-of-fact individual may occasionally be swayed by them, in spite of himself. Now, I flattered myself that I was one of these same individuals. I laid claim to no superfluous imaginations and fancies. I was no believer in ghosts or spirit-rapping, yet I leave it for others to judge whether what I'm about to tell is, or is not, to be accounted for by purely natural laws, worked out by a chance combination of time, place, and circumstance. Ever since I can remember, it had been our habit to spend Christmas with our old friends the Sequins, generally at their seat called the Bower, not far from the principal town of a celebrated hunting county, about 100 miles from London. It was a picturesque and thorough specimen of a time-honoured manor house, with scarcely a room, corridor, or passage that had not a legend of some kind attached to it. The family, too, was one of the most ancient in England, and many were the tales connected with the daring deeds performed and the knightly prowess displayed by its ancestors. My father and old Sir George Sequin were contemporaries, and had religiously kept up the custom, which, I believe, had been even handed down to them by their fathers, of always dining together on Christmas Day. From them, Godfrey Sequin and I had again inherited the idea that things would go extremely wrong if the festive season was not spent in each other's company. He particularly had strong opinions on the point, and his anxiety that nothing should interfere with the custom sometimes bordered upon the superstitious. Heirs to the jovial and kindly feelings of our fathers, we had carefully maintained this principle, but as long ago my circumstances had so far changed as to render it impossible for me to entertain Godfrey and his wife in anything like their own style of living, the hospitality had been all on his side, and it had become a settled plan that we should go down to the Bower for a fortnight every Christmas. I had been married some few years, when just before one of these much-looked-forward-to expeditions, my wife was taken suddenly but not dangerously ill, and there seemed every probability of our good old custom being broken through for the first time. The doctors pronounced it madness for her to think of taking a journey in the state of health she then was. Letters passed to and fro between the Bower and Bloomsbury Square. Devices and suggestions for surmounting the difficulty arose on both sides. I was to go with one of my girls, the other to remain with her mother. Sir Godfrey and Lady Sequin were to come to us. Some plan must be adopted, if possible, to prevent our being separated at Christmas. I did not myself feel the absolute necessity of this, but the Sequins held strong opinions about it. It would be terribly unlucky. We ought not to break through the rule whilst there was the slightest chance of maintaining it. Godfrey was even more urgent than his wife, and his letters had in them almost an imploring tone, bespeaking, as I fancied, an over-anxiety and fear that something dire might happen if I failed to occupy my usual seat at his Christmas table. Affairs remained in this uncertain state until within a few days of the 25th of December, when my wife, having somewhat recovered, settled the difficulty by deciding, with that combined spirit of self-sacrifice and determination which some women display in emergencies, that considering Godfrey's earnest wish, I ought to go down alone for a day or two at least. Her kind heart at once led her to set aside all her own feelings on the matter. She could not bear to think that my friend's happiness should be interfered with by any dislike she might feel at being left alone at such a time. She said that she should become quite superstitious herself if she were to cause the breach of this old-established custom. After all, she continued, what is it but a few days' absence? I should think nothing of it at any other season, and it is only imagination which leads one to attribute more importance to it just now, and I, you know, have very little imagination, whilst your friend Godfrey and his wife are made up of it. Reluctantly, then, I settled to go. I say reluctantly, for the moment I had consented, a strange and unusual feeling of depression came upon me. I could not but admit the common sense of my wife's words, but nevertheless to me, ridiculous foreboding of evil, or, at the least, a sense of discomfort, rooted itself in my mind. Apart from the joviality of Christmas meetings, I was the last person in the world to attribute any serious importance to their not being kept up. Still, I failed to get over the disquiet which the present arrangement had created. However, I bade my wife and girls good-bye on the 23rd, determining that, as Christmas Day fell on the Wednesday, to return at the end of the week, instead of remaining, as usual, for the customary programme of hunting, shooting, etc. On my way down, everything seemed to combine to lower my spirits, the only other occupants of the railway carriage being a young widow lady and her 2 little children. Her grief was very fresh, and it was with the greatest difficulty once or twice that she restrained herself from hysterical paroxysms of tears. The weather, too, was muggy and gloomy. Thick mists had settled determinedly over all parts of the flat country through which my journey lay. Do what I would, I could not help contrasting the present state of the atmosphere with the crisp, frosty brightness and invigorating air which I remembered had set my usually elastic disposition bounding like a child's when I travelled over the same ground a year ago. The hearty welcome at the Bower only temporarily dismissed this demon of disquiet from my elbow, and I so continually relapsed into silence during dinner that 2 or 3 of my old friends assembled at the house, and Godfrey especially, noticed my dejection, but dealt lightly with it, as of course my wife's absence being universally regretted, at the same time also accounted for my own unwonted demeanour. The mirth generally, for some reason, was not as great, it struck me, as on previous occasions. The following day, which was Christmas Eve, we were still very dull, and my own feelings considerably worse. I had grown horribly anxious, for the morning's post had brought no letter from my wife, although she had promised to write a line in the afternoon of the day I started. There was really nothing in this circumstance, yet somehow or other I was so unhinged that it had an effect upon me quite inconsistent with its importance. There were no means by which my mind could be speedily set at rest, for these were the early days of electric telegraphy, and the system of communication was very incomplete. Dankborough, the county town, was as yet without wires, and we were 40 miles from the nearest telegraph station. The arguments of Lady Sequin and her husband all failed to rouse and cheer me up, and in the most unnatural way my dejection rather communicated itself to them, for they began to feel that perhaps it had been a little selfish on their part to insist on my presence under the circumstances. It was the most dismal Christmas Eve we could remember. We voted it so by acclamation, vainly endeavouring to extract a joke from our universal opinion. On retiring for the night, my condition of mind, far from improving, became so deplorable that I thought I was losing my senses, or going to have a serious illness. The picturesque, old-fashioned room allotted to me, called the Mirror Chamber, was, I knew, noted in the annals of the house for several legends attached to it. None of these, however, lived individually in my mind, but highly wrought as it then was, this recollection communicated an uncanny, ghostly appearance to the place, which it would not have borne, indeed, which it never had borne to me on ordinary occasions.